That was great information, Bruce, and I just wanted to thank Blair for his nice introduction earlier. And also to say I'm really glad that this conference has included a session on land in discussing resource governance in Africa. And I'm not an expert in mining, but I enjoyed the sessions on mining, and it really got me reflecting on the similarities and differences, as Blair had mentioned in his introduction. And I just wanted to flag a couple things that I think are different, let's say. One being one that Bruce already highlighted, which is that the land issue is different from mineral extraction in a key sense, that land is not just a provision of livelihood for smallholders, but it is also intimately connected to questions of food security. And as we know, and the latest figures came out from the FAO in the fall of their annual report on the extent of food insecurity in the world. And since the food crisis, sub-Saharan Africa has actually fared worse than it did before the food crisis. And so what this tells us is that food security is a very fragile situation in sub-Saharan Africa, and when we talk about land and foreign investors acquiring land, we have to think carefully about the implications for food security. So I think that is somewhat different, because there tends to be an assumption that it's okay to export minerals. It's not okay to export food, especially when so many sub-Saharan African countries are dependent on food imports themselves. So that's just one thing I wanted to flag. And the other thing that I just wanted to mention is that I think we've talked a lot about governance gaps throughout this workshop, and the governance gaps range all the way from the investment receiving countries, the African countries themselves, but all the way back up internationally. And I would say that on the land issue, some of the biggest governance gaps are actually at the international level. And that's sort of an entryway into saying that's why I'm going to focus most of my comments actually on the investor side, the international side, to try and understand why it is that, as Bruce already started us into this conversation, why it is that land has suddenly become so attractive to investors, but what is driving their practices, and what kind of governance, where are the wedges where we can get better governance to address these kind of situations. So that's what I want to talk about. I want to focus more on the international context and why this has happened. And I guess my PowerPoint has come up here. That's great. And just to also say that in terms of the land rush, as Bruce already introduced, we've seen a lot in the media about this global land rush. And as Bruce already pointed out, the majority of these land deals are actually acquiring land in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a complex set of factors that are making African land so attractive to investors. It's very, very messy, and I really appreciated Dr. Cheru's comment this morning that he loved his work because it's so messy, and I would say that applies in this instance too. But what I'd like to try and make some sense out of the mess a little bit by focusing on one set of actors in particular, as I said already, the investors, but almost even more particularly the financial investors. I want to look at financial markets and their role in the international land acquisitions, and in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. So by taking this lens, I'm clearly probably going to leave some things out, so I'm hoping in question period we can get to this. But something that I would say driving a lot of what's going on in this messy, complicated picture is something that we refer to as financialization. And financialization simply means the growing role of financial actors, financial institutions, financial rules, et cetera, in a particular sector. And this is happening in lots of sectors across the global economy, and I would say that the land sector is no exception. In fact, the agricultural sector in general. We hear a lot about this phrase, the financialization of food. But I would say it's even more complex than that. If you look at the graphic on the PowerPoint, is that the financialization of agriculture and commodities is intimately linked with investments in biofuels, which is intimately linked with land acquisitions. And Bruce already pulled out some of these. But part of the reason why these activities are linked is because new financial instruments have come onto global financial markets that are actually linking these things directly. We have new products that are referred to as commodity index funds that didn't exist a couple of decades ago, but they're now heavily traded on financial markets, and they're basically bundling agricultural commodities, they're bundling energy, they're bundling even minerals. We've been talking a lot about mining the last few days. And basically, these products track the prices of these various commodities in a bundle. And so suddenly we're seeing prices of energy, prices of land, prices of minerals almost moving together cyclically through the global economy, and financial investors then see these things as linked, and then the investments themselves become linked. And so I want to get a little bit into this complex nexus, as I call it, of agricultural investment, which pulls land grabs into these other kinds of dynamics. And I guess just to put this slide first is to really stress that while the focus here is on land, I think it's really hard to separate land from some of these other bigger dynamics, which is why I want to talk about them together. And as this has happened, investors have been drawn to this sector in particular because of this promise of higher expected financial returns. So really in the wake of the collapse of the housing and mortgage bubble, investors were looking to diversify their investment portfolios, and here we see these commodities, agricultural commodities, land, and biofuels in particular, looking quite attractive. So these commodities look attractive, and Africa in particular has been seen as one of the most attractive sources of these commodities, the land in particular. This graphic, I was startled to find it. It's actually from a brochure from South African Bank, Standard Bank, which talks a fair bit in this booklet about investing in African land. It uses the word allure, I think, about 20 times, and shows pictures like this, where large tracts of land in sub-Saharan Africa that look virtually vacant. And we're told, what does it say? Africa's dormant resources potential. It's all over the place. This kind of discourse that Africa is basically this next frontier. And there's a little pamphlet from the African Development Bank explaining some of the drive behind the land acquisitions, and I think they really put their finger on it. They point out that the financial investors who want to get a piece of the action, and they look to Africa in a sense because they're looking for assets that have consistent demand but inelastic supply. And it's seen that land fits this perfectly, and African land in particular fits these investors' desire because, and as this report and many others point out, they use the statistic, and I don't know where they get it from. I need to find out. But they basically say that 60% of the world's arable yet uncultivated land is in sub-Saharan Africa. So in other words, of the land that we can grow crops on that currently isn't growing crops, it's in Africa. 60% of it's in Africa, hence a lot of the investors are quite intrigued with sub-Saharan Africa. And so just to stress these various pamphlets and websites from these banking institutions, hedge funds, insurance funds, all kinds of funds that are encouraging financial investment in products that are linked to land in sub-Saharan Africa, portray the land as being underutilized, as I already said, and as Bruce tried to make clear to us isn't actually the case. But they use these terms such as, getting in while it's still cheap. If you get in early, you're going to be able to reap the profits. And as Bruce already highlighted, the complexity of the links with these other aspects of this nexus, around 60 to 75% of the investments in land in sub-Saharan Africa are specifically for biofuel production, not for the food production, as he so clearly pointed out. And these investments are very much mediated through these financial actors who I mentioned, these kinds of investment funds, the hedge funds, private equity funds, et cetera. And I would argue that there's kind of a self-generating cycle where the financialization of agricultural commodities through futures markets has been pinpointed by many actors. I know it's a controversial issue, but many actors, including the Bank for International Settlements, even admitted that rising speculation in agricultural commodity futures markets has actually exacerbated food price volatility. And as food prices and energy prices become more volatile through these linked commodity index funds, then investors are trying to find an investment that lets them hedge against those increasing prices, hence their interest in land. And this, it's in a sense almost a self-generating cycle of investment. And so these financial firms are basically trying to tap into this cycle, and they're trying to tap into people's sense that they want to get in early, they want to get in when it's cheap, and earn enormous returns. And some of these funds, by the way, they're promising investors over 25% a year returns on their investment, which is enormous compared to any other investment on the market these days. But what's interesting to me is that this question, as I started with, is why all of a sudden sub-Saharan Africa? Is it just because of the food crisis that suddenly people want to acquire land in sub-Saharan Africa? I would argue that it goes a lot deeper than that, and it has a much deeper historical roots than just the food crisis. The food crisis might have been a trigger, but there have been some long trends that have made this possible, because it hasn't been so easy for casual investors to buy a piece of Africa. Historically, I mean, colonialism ended. There were all kinds of regulations preventing foreigners from buying land. Why all of a sudden is this perfectly legal and perfectly possible? And why is it that pension funds, for example, can buy huge tracts of land? Well, I would say a couple things set the stage, and I want to talk about these. The first is basically liberalization of foreign investment codes. And this has occurred since the 1980s. I could only find data going back to the early 1990s, but I pulled this out of various UNCTAD World Investment Reports. These reports come out every year, and they're great in the sense that they track all of the different changes to FDI regulations in all countries around the world, and then they tell you what percentage of those changes were more liberalizing and what percentage were more regulatory or more constraining. And so over the past 20 years, you can see there's been a pattern, even though since the financial crisis, there's been a bit more tighter regulation on FDI. But throughout all the 1990s, almost all of the regulatory changes were liberalizing. In other words, they were inviting foreign investment to come. They were getting rid of regulations that restricted foreign investment. And this was really a product, I would say, of the 1980s and structural adjustment programs, the IMF and the World Bank basically giving funds to African governments in exchange for policy reform, and those policy reforms included huge liberalization, particularly of investment codes, because the IMF and the World Bank wanted to see these countries open their doors to foreign investment. And I would say that this basically is a huge reason why it's been so easy for foreign investors to come in to sub-Saharan Africa, because the investment codes have been greatly liberalized. And a second key thing that I want to talk about that has also facilitated this kind of financial investment, including in land and commodities, has been a deregulation of global financial markets. And here, the graphic I put together here really focuses on the US market as the largest commodity futures market in the world, the Chicago Board of Trade, and the US has long had regulations that have been pretty strict in terms of trying to control agricultural commodity futures markets so that markets wouldn't be manipulated, that traders wouldn't be able to hoard, to drive up prices, to harm food security, to harm farmers' livelihoods, et cetera. So there were pretty strict regulations. There were position limits that were put in place. There were reporting requirements, all kinds of regulatory measures that put constraints on these financial markets. But starting in the 1980s, similar to the period, period of structural adjustment, this was a period of liberalization and this sort of neoliberal economic model spreading around the world. US financial regulation also was affected by this. And so there was pressure from banks in particular on the regulatory bodies in the US, on the financial markets, to please relax some of these rules. And so the rules in particular that were relaxed were these ones around position limits. And that's kind of, without eating too much into my time, but just to explain, these rules basically say if you're not a farmer, if you're not a processor, if you're not a grain storage handler, there's only so much of the market you can hold. That's what a position limit says. Those are non-commercial traders. In other words, they're not actively agricultural actors. They cannot hold very much of that market because the idea is we don't want speculators manipulating the market. So there were limits on what they could do. But starting in the 1980s, banks wanted to start to sell these new products that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, these commodity index funds and other kinds of derivatives of agricultural commodities. And they argued to the regulatory body in the US that they faced real risks and needed to hedge those risks, and therefore they should have these position limits lifted on what they could do. And so they made the argument, they convinced the regulator that they should be able to get exempted from these rules, and they should be allowed to engage in these markets in big time. And once they were able to get this kind of, it started with something called no action letters. They were getting individual permission to sort of be exempt from the rules, and then this started to, really in the 1990s, started to blossom, and these financial institutions were able to get all kinds of exemptions. 5 minutes, okay. And so then they started to sell these commodity index funds in huge proportions, and it was right around the year 2000, there was another regulatory measure, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which basically exempted all those kinds of commodity index trades from regulatory oversight altogether. And so it became kind of a free bonanza for financial institutions, hedge funds, and all kinds of banks to sell these kinds of derivatives on commodity, based on agricultural commodities, which then created this big bubble in the commodity markets, which drove up commodity prices, which then, as I already mentioned, became this complex nexus with biofuels and land acquisitions. So it may seem like a side part of the story, but I would actually argue it's quite central to the whole nexus of investment that is going on. And so when just to sum it up, these two big things going on: deregulation of FDI in African countries, deregulation of global financial markets. You add them together, and basically what it enables is casual investors in rich industrialized countries to very easily acquire financial products that are based on commodities in sub-Saharan Africa. And so what we saw then is, as Bruce, I'd be quick here, Bruce already talked about this huge increase in land investment in sub-Saharan Africa over the past decade. Reports vary. I think Bruce's figure came from the Land Portal, which is from the Land Coalition. The figure I have here from The Economist is a little bit different, but all over the place, but it's a lot. And the bulk of it is going to sub-Saharan Africa. And the top countries for land acquisitions are actually Sudan, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. But I think looking across the data, nearly every sub-Saharan African country has had investment from foreign investors in land. So this is going on big time. And as I already mentioned, and just to stress, I quite like this graphic, which I took from a IIED briefing on the role of hedge funds in land acquisitions. But basically, I think a simple way to put it is that these financial institutions basically become intermediaries between investors in the rich countries and assets in developing countries. In this case, we can talk about land, we can talk about the capacity to produce biofuel and commodities themselves. And without those financial institutions being there, without that bigger context I already mentioned, these kinds of investments wouldn't be happening. So I would say that this is why they're happening, and the financial institutions themselves, it's kind of strange, and I've already been given my 5-minute warning, so I can't go into it in great detail. But basically, those investment funds in the middle are taking the money from the investors, then they're often purchasing the land, then they turn around and lease the land to operators who are often growing crops for biofuels, then for export. And so the hedge funds in the middle are making money not just from leasing the land, but the other operators are making money from selling the products. And it's very messy, and I'm giving this impression, and my sense is that this is what's going on from the Western industrialized countries. Chinese sovereign wealth funds operating in Africa might have a completely different model. It's very messy, and I think a lot more research needs to be done on that. And this is just a sample of a web. It's really easy. You just go online and start Googling African farmland and hedge funds, and all kinds of things pop up. But this is just an example of one. Green World, advertising. Here, you can put your money here, and it's actually quite easy. And they're really targeting pension funds in particular because they'd like. 2 minutes. I'm almost done. They would really like their money. Pension funds overall manage $23 trillion in assets. 100 billion of pension fund money goes to commodities, and around 15 to 20 billion of that money is directly in land. So they're big, big players, and most of us are members of pension funds. We probably don't know what the manager of the pension fund of our organization is doing with the money. There's a good chance that something like this is going on. This is another example of one of these hedge fund websites. I just wanted to show it, and I put the circle there around it, where this is a really weird one in particular, but they actually are bragging that the contract clauses allow foreign companies to keep exporting as much as 80% of what's grown on the acquired land, even if the country is experiencing food shortages, as if this is a selling point. And then it goes right on to say, you know, of course, we follow all kinds of wonderful practices. You do have to wonder. I spent a fair bit of time on this website, and just to let you know, well, first of all, I don't think the hay bales are actually in sub-Saharan Africa. But secondly, they have a little downloadable brochure, which is riddled with typos. And it's based in an offshore, you know, it's based in the Seychelles and the Dominican Republic, which is tax haven city, so you gotta wonder. Anyway, I realize I'm running out of time, and I don't have time to sort of explain this particular graphic, but this is something that I put together as I was trying to conceptualize and help to explain to people how this is really working. But basically, all kinds of investors are putting their money into these financial institutions, and it's like a funnel. And those financial institutions themselves have really weird relationships to each other, that hedge funds are selling to pension funds, and they're all, you know, it's all like a weird party going on in there. But basically, what happens is those investments often have what I would say are externalities. There's externalities in terms of people being displaced from the land, externalities in terms of biofuel production leading to cleared forests, and externalities basically in terms of food price volatility, which is affecting people's access to food. All kinds of stuff is going on as a result. Okay, wrap up, 0, got it. I think I'm almost to the last slide, there we are. So basically, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is the question of governance, to come back to it. I started with it and I want to end with it. But what we're seeing right now is a bit of a burst of activity and interest in responsible investment. And it's not just responsibility in terms of the firms themselves that are running these agricultural operations, but it's more the financial actors themselves and the investors themselves. And so we've seen in the last couple of years the development of various codes of conduct on the investment side, and they're actually all different, and they're complicated and confusing. But one of the more interesting ones is called the Principles for Responsible Investment in Farmland, and it was developed by some members of the Principles for Responsible Investment, but they're not officially endorsed by the Principles for Responsible Investment. It's just kind of a splinter group that has decided to do this. There's also the UN-based voluntary guidelines on land tenure, which Bruce talked about, which was adopted by the Committee on World Food Security, has much more weight to it, but it's very much focused on the recipient country providing tenure security in the recipient country, and the other guidelines are more about investors acting responsibly. And so there's lots of things in between, and lots of individual funds themselves are issuing CSR reports saying that they are practicing responsible investment. But I would say that at this point, this is all very new, and I think there's a lot we could probably learn in this sector from what we talked about yesterday and today on mining, because there's a much richer body of experience as well as studies on what exactly this responsible investment in extractive industries looks like. I think in the land sector, it's also new that it's hard to say for sure if somebody claims they're being responsible. Do we really know that they are? And I would say that this is something we need to pay attention to. And sorry I went over time. Thanks.